I wanted to talk a little bit about one person. And let me sort of back up for a second. On the first day of my first Chinese history class ever, a professor came into class and he asked all the students to take out a blank piece of paper, and he said, I want you folks to draw a map of the world. And this was at Stanford. There were about 20 people in the class. This was before China became a really hot topic. And we all got out our pieces of paper, and to a man and a woman, we all started on the far left corner of the map with Seattle. And by the time we all got down to San Diego, we realized that there would be no room on that map for any other country but the United States, much less China. And this was sort of a little bit of a cheesy exercise, but nonetheless a very illustrative exercise, because it showed me, and something that I've kept with, a lesson that I kept with to this day, that there is often very little room in the mental map that Americans have for China. And more importantly, I think there's very little room on the mental map Americans have for the Chinese. And with that in mind, I'd like to talk about political and social changes in China through the story of one guy. Let me bring you back a little bit to May of 1989. I was a reporter in Beijing at the time for the Associated Press. In May of 1989, I had just been posted to China. I'd been sent to China in 1988. This was my first foreign posting. I had spent years studying Chinese, years preparing as a journalist, and this was a culmination of my life at that time. And May of 1989 in China, there were literally on almost every day in Beijing, there were 1 million people on the streets demonstrating for something. They were not quite clear exactly what they were demonstrating for, but they were demonstrating against the system that they were living under and for a future that they wanted to determine. Whether it was democracy or anything else, that's anyone's guess. But it was a very interesting time. And for me as a reporter, it was, like I said, the culmination of my life at that time. During those demonstrations, I was introduced to an officer from the People's Liberation Army. We'll call him Officer Liu. And Officer Liu was a fascinating character. He was tall, he was dashing. Of course, he had black hair. He was very good looking. And he had a very firm handshake, which was unusual in many Chinese people, because from a culture where people are used to bowing for many centuries, they never really developed the firm handshake idea. But Officer Liu had that firm handshake. So it set him apart from his fellow countrymen. He was a special kind of officer in the PLA because he was a cultural officer. He was a composer of classical music and jazz. The PLA has a vast array of enterprises. And they have movie studios, classical symphonies, they have dance troupes, and he was in that part of the PLA. But because of his status and rank as an officer, he had access to scuttlebutt and to information that was useful, very useful to a reporter such as myself. So we became fast friends. And we would talk a lot, and one day in late May of 1989, he gave me a call, and he said, Little Pan, that's my nickname in Chinese, Little Pan, come up to my area, we need to talk. So I drove my car up there, and he came out, and he got into my car, and he proceeded to read me a speech presaging the declaration of martial law. I was with another reporter from the Associated Press. At that time, both of us had been working about 20 hours a day. We were sleeping on the square. We were biking all over the city. We were chasing down rumors of troop movements in and around Beijing. We basically, we're living and breathing this, what we thought was potentially a revolution against the Chinese Communist Party. So I graced with my first period in a car, relaxed, and offered the greatest scoop of my life up until that time. I snoozed. I just dozed off. And Dan, the fellow who was sitting in the seat in front of me, dozed off as well. Suffice it to say that the Chinese government cracked down, killing an unknown number of people starting on June 3rd and June 4th. and ended that movement for some type of a different future for their country. A couple weeks after the crackdown happened, the US Embassy opened because it had been closed during much of the crackdown period. And on that same day, I received a call. I was in the AP Bureau. I received a call from the local precinct that deals with foreigners in China. And I was ordered to report to that precinct. We went to the embassy and got a consular official. My bureau chief came with me, but they were denied entry into the room. And so there I was with two relatively small guys with very dainty hands. And we spent 6 hours in that room they were interrogating me. And the main subject of the interrogation was my relationship with Officer Liu. They brought out photographs of us. They'd been tracking us. Obviously, his reading of this speech in that car had been recorded on a microphone. So they basically had him and they had me. I denied it. I said our relationship consisted basically of discussing girls and jazz. They didn't take that. And at the end of this 6 hours, they left the room and they came back in with a small blue document. And they read it and they said, Pan Aiwen, which is my Chinese name, you are neither cooperative nor friendly. You have violated the terms of martial law provisions in China, and you have stolen state secrets, and we hereby are giving you 3 days to leave the country. So I was expelled. That same evening, my expulsion, along with that of a correspondent from the Voice of America, led the nightly news. And Officer Liu was, at that time, in a safe house run by the Ministry of State Security. He was brought in to watch the TV, and his minder said, you see, he's told us everything about you. You're finished as well. The experience of learning that he'd been arrested was an enormous lesson for me. Before that, I had been very blithe, very naive, and relatively careless in dealing with Chinese. I knew that bad things happened to Chinese people, but I never thought that something would happen to someone close to me. Back into the idea of the map, it wasn't that whole idea that bad things can happen to people close to you in China was not on the very limited map that I had written or I had drawn of China in my head. So I left China, went on my merry way, and I returned to China in 1998 to live as the bureau chief of the Washington Post. At that time, the Chinese government, during press conferences, used to love to swing their cameras onto the face of the foreign journalists in the audience as a very not so subtle way of telling their people, you see, the foreign devils want to come to listen to us talk. So I often heard from my friends that, oh, I saw you on TV last night. One evening, I got a call from somebody who said, hello, I'm calling on behalf of an old friend of yours. Can you come out and have a drink? So I did. And he had been calling on behalf of Officer Liu. So I went and saw the friend, and sometime later I arranged to see Officer Liu. It's a very difficult thing, and it was a very difficult thing to do for me to meet somebody whose incarceration I was directly responsible for. It wasn't my fault, if you will, but I was the reason he was locked up in jail. So I went to his house, walked up the 3 stories. He lived in a 3-story walk-up, rang the doorbell and sort of stood there for a while. He opens the door, and he basically had to pull me into his apartment because, I mean, I wanted to see him, but it was, it's a very complex emotion of guilt and curiosity, almost a perverse curiosity in a way, and also affection because we were close friends. He still had the same warm handshake, very firm handshake. He'd grown a beard. He hadn't gained weight. He looked good. So he told me about his life, and he told me about what happened to him since his incarceration. He had been sentenced to 2.5 years in jail, which is a very interesting sentence, the way he explained it for a People's Liberation officer. Anything more than 2.5 years meant he would have been kicked out of the military. 2.5 years or less means he could still stay in the military. So when he got out of jail, he still had his apartment. He'd lost his wife. She'd married somebody else. And he still had his salary, but he didn't have a job. He was a composer. He wanted to write music, but the PLA wouldn't let him do that. Every week, the commissar, the local political commissar, would come to his house and say, "Have you changed your thoughts?" And he would say, "Get out of my face." This happened for months. Finally, he made the decision to get out of Beijing, and where did he go? He went to Shenzhen. Shenzhen at that time, now that all of China now is sort of obsessed with the hyper-capitalism and economic reform, but Shenzhen at that time, we have to remember, was one of the only places where the embers of economic reform were still glowing. Hainan Island was another place with its great real estate boom, but Shenzhen really was the center of where economic reform was happening. And a lot of Tiananmen Square troubled people went there to recreate their lives. Officer Liu went to Shenzhen and got into construction. He started working on he was doing drywall and building malls. When several of his friends from Hong Kong, fellow composers, found out he was working on construction projects in Shenzhen, contacted his foreman and said, "This guy's good. Give him a desk job. We'll pay you." And Officer Liu began to get commissions for songs. And slowly, he began to effectively become a composer again. By the mid-1990s, he was writing a lot for singers as the cantopop boom was sweeping China. By the late 1990s, he had left the People's Liberation Army. Just at that time, there was the beginnings of this intense wave of nostalgia for Cultural Revolution songs and the songs of the 1950s. Officer Liu rode that wave. He began to write operas celebrating obscure victories of the Communist Party. At the 110th anniversary of Mao's birth, he wrote the score to the propaganda film behind that movie. When China had what they called the glorious victory over SARS, again, another documentary came out, he wrote the score to that as well. I went to maybe 6 of his shows. They were a very bizarre combination a very kitschy combination, sort of Versace meets Karen Carpenter. Well, I think it sort of best sums up the feeling you can get. I love Karen Carpenter, even though she's dead. But one show in Shenzhen, he not only wrote the score, but he wrote the lyrics. And one of the lyrics really stuck with me. It was, "The high tide of the revolution, each wave higher than the last." And he repeated this expression 15 times. The reason why it stuck with me is the word high tide in Chinese also means orgasm. And at the end of the show, we went out for dinner, and I said, "What's with all the high tides?" And especially each wave higher than the last. And he laughed, and he looked at me and basically said, "Look, I have to make fun of my audience somehow." The reason I'm telling you this long story about high tides is that people like Officer Liu have made a Faustian bargain with the system under which they live. He has a very good life. He's got 2 big apartments in Beijing. He's got mistresses if he wants them. He's got a wonderful little boy. He's got a damaged relationship with his wife, but so does pretty much everyone in his generation. He's got a TV as big as my car in California. He is living very well, but he's also living in a system that he despises. But at the same time, he thinks and he believes that he cannot live without that system. I think that's a very important thing for us to think about when we look at China's middle class. Finally, I think that in this Faustian bargain, something has happened to his spirit, something has happened to his soul, and something has happened to that of many other Chinese who've been forced in circumstances less coercive than his to make the same deal. He wrote me a letter about his changes and the changes that happened to him, and I wanted to share a part of that letter with you. The letter went like this: "Before I went to prison, I was pure-hearted. But inside, the one thing they taught me was how to be tactful, slick, and diplomatic. My political commissars taught me how to lie. They taught me to be insincere. So I learned it and learned it well, and that's how I play it now. I think Officer Liu could be writing for a whole generation. So I've only talked for 15 minutes. We could talk about this or other issues, about religion or a variety of other things, but I just wanted to sort of offer that story. Ambassador Lilly ended his wonderful talk last night with an anecdote. All I have to share is an anecdote, but I'm willing to talk at length about other things as well. So thanks a lot.